Kinesthetic, or tactile learning, learning by engaging in physical activities, is something that we as human beings are inherently very good at. From the time we're born, we learn about our surroundings and our environment by engaging all 5 of our senses: our sight, our smell, taste, our hearing, and our touch. This is the premise for any modern day daycare facility, elementary school, preschool. There are these learning environments where kids are able to interact with their surroundings, and this helps stimulate their ability as well as their desire to learn. However, as we grow and we move on to higher learning, high school, and even more so in college, we start to phase away from that utilization of all 5 senses, and we only really focus on 2 senses, our eyes and our ears. Once you get to college, the majority of information is presented in the form of textbooks and lecture. Even as far back as medieval times, this has been the format for higher learning. If we look at this picture, we'll see something that probably looks oddly familiar. A lot of these students here are very engaged in what the speaker has to talk about. They want to learn. However, if you look closely, you'll see some students in the back talking, other students that are more focused on what their neighbor's doing, students sleeping, or just students not paying any attention. If you're a professor, unfortunately, this is probably all too familiar to you. It's unfortunate, but what do you expect? We're not all strong audio and visual learners. We don't all learn the same. We are not created equal. This is called the learning pyramid, and what it does is it essentially lays out the different styles of learning and the likelihood for long-term retention in the student's brain. Now, if we look at the bottom, we all know that being able to teach the information to others is the best way to learn it. However, what I'm more focused on is this top section right here. Lecture, reading, and learning, utilizing our eyes and our ears primarily, pose the least likelihood for long-term retention. Why then, I ask, is this the premise for all of higher education? I believe that scholars and educators have a duty, and that duty is to educate students. I think it's preposterous to assume that all students can learn the information that's presented in the same way to everybody. I know students like myself, kinesthetic learners, who need to feel the information, don't do so hot in lectures or by reading out of textbooks. So, I'm going to shift over to an experience that I had several weeks back. I was in a lecture in my advanced cellular and molecular biology class. We're studying the phospholipid bilayer of eukaryotic cells. This is the semi-permeable membrane that basically regulates what comes in and out of cells, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, of other functions. And so my professor's going on and on about all of these different functions of this membrane and how complex it is. And I suddenly couldn't help but imagine how much easier it would be for a student like myself to learn this information, as well as how cool it would be if I were somehow able to shrink down and literally walk within that membrane. I just imagine this. It would be so awesome. I remember imagining these fatty acid tails rubbing up against my body as I walked through it and peeking through these transport membrane protein channels and watching as glucose and other biomolecules were shuttled in and out of the cell. Then I began to take the idea a little bit further. What if I were to peek inside of this membrane and stumble in upon this vast empire that is the cell? I remember visualizing ribosomes translating messenger RNA strands into polypeptide proteins, and then watching as those proteins whisked down the endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi apparatus for more processing. And so I apologize for those of you who aren't very familiar with the cell. My intention is not to stand up here and give a lecture on the cell and discuss all of its functions. I'm just trying to point out that the cell is this very, very complex entity, and it takes years and years to learn about. For those of you who are more familiar with the field of biology, you're probably used to looking at diagrams like this. I know personally I've been looking at this diagram, if not very, very similar diagrams, in just about every biology class that I've taken since I was in 7th grade or so. We keep having to revisit and relearn and revisit these same structures of the cell year after year after year. there's a lot going on. The cell is very, very complex. To give you an idea of how complex the cell is, you could imagine taking the city of Manhattan and the city of Tokyo, combining the two, and then shrinking them down to fit inside of a sphere much, much smaller than a grain of sand. And so you can imagine with all this complexity in such a small space, why it takes years and years and years to gain a firm grasp on all of the concepts of the cell. Some people are able to devote their entire lives to studying the cell, and they may never fully grasp all that the cell has to offer. So, going back to that idea, the ability to shrink down within the cell and study it from within, this would be amazing for a student like myself. It would decrease the time that it would take to learn about the cell drastically. However, someone brought it to my attention that this is not an original idea whatsoever. This has been thought of before. Thank you. I'm really glad you guys have seen this before. For those of you who haven't, the Magic School Bus, this was a cartoon that aired back in the day. These students and their teacher would hop inside this school bus and shrink down to the molecular size, and then they would go off and explore vast biomes and environments. So I understand that we're not at a point in time where we can accomplish this. It's not physically possible right now. But I want you to consider the opposite. I want you to imagine that you're in 8th grade again, and your science teacher has taken the class on a field trip to this brand new hands-on interactive facility that was built downtown to replicate the exact structure and layout of the human cell. You and your friends are able to take a tour throughout the cytoplasm. You're able to feel the mosaic of the phospholipid bilayer. You're able to hear the sounds coming out of these organelles. I can only imagine the sounds roaring out of the mitochondria as it cranks out these ATP energy molecules. However, I understand that, again, we're not at a point in time where we're physically capable of doing this. We can't just synthesize these huge life-size organelles that have the same chemical structure and function as the organelles that exist within cells. We're also not at a point where we're able to shrink down in some magical school bus to go and study the cells from within. However, this is the power of imagination. I believe that by visualizing these perfect learning environments for students to utilize all 5 of their senses, I believe that this can give us a model that we can reach for and try to achieve as we try to replicate some of these methods. And I can only imagine what this could do for the future of education, for any field of study, for students around the world. Thank you very much.